Hello, this is Derek Hansen for StrengthPowerSpeed.com, and I'd like to welcome you to our 7th episode of our Performance Concepts Chat. In this episode, we have a return guest in Carl Valle, and also joined by our own John Abreu to talk about this concept of culture, particularly as it relates to sporting organizations, and this idea that you can come in and you can either create a brand new culture that's successful, or you can extend and continue with this amazing culture to breed success for the future. But rarely do we find out about the details of that environment and the process that accompanies it. And so we're left with sort of a secret formula, I guess. And I think in our discussion here, we're trying to figure out, well, what does it mean when you talk about culture of an organization, and what are the elements, and what are the steps that you have to take? Because I think we're made to think that it's quite easy to have somebody come in and just change the culture overnight, and implement their plan and their ideas and their concepts, and yes, we'll have success. But it's a very convenient word. It's I even say in the podcast that it's kind of a lazy word, because I know when I think of culture, I think about when I was a child in school and we talked about civilizations or ethnicities or countries and the culture that they had. And when we talked about culture, it was the language, it was the arts, the music, the dance, the way they organized their events, their social events, the way they organized their dwellings in the village, and these are things that have been developed over centuries, and not necessarily perfected, but something that's been embedded over time, and very difficult to change once everybody understood what the expectation was in the culture. So hearing about somebody coming into an organization and saying, we're going to change the culture and we're going to do it in 1 to 2 years, is kind of interesting to me. So we get into it in this talk. We talk about all the specifics of what could happen within an organization, and some of the fallacies and myths as well. So I really hope you enjoy this conversation, and it generates some more talk and feedback about this concept of culture in sports. So I hope you enjoy this episode.
I think the purpose of this discussion is to really get the word team culture, specifically after that, the New England Patriots just won the Super Bowl, and now everyone is tweeting, kind of the buzzword of culture. And if they lost, would have everyone jumped on Atlanta and said, that's the new, they defeated the king, they dethroned the king, so now Atlanta has the culture. With such a close game, it's almost like whoever wins, it's sort of like the strength coach of the year because of the best quarterback, or whatever team wins seems to have the best culture for that year. If they don't win the Super Bowl next year, did the culture suddenly dry up?
Yeah, well, even in
So
the pregame, I think they were talking about Atlanta saying, "Oh, the head coach has brought this great culture," and
yeah.
then, of course, they lose. Let's get rid of the D coordinator, offensive coordinator takes off. So
Yeah, I mean, so that's a good point. Is the first question is, why are we talking about team culture? It seems that any conversation that gets started on trying to win, no matter what the situation is, you could have the worst quarterback, on the team, or obviously we're big football fans, or even if a team that's in the NBA that's losing, or hockey, it seems that, well, they have a culture issue. And now that's clear with some teams that you can tell have huge amount of Pro Bowlers or All Stars, and they somehow aren't winning. Well, that's a team chemistry issue. Maybe it's in the '90s when the Cowboys had some issues legally with some of the players. It didn't really matter too much because they found a way to win because they were just loaded with talent. So I think that the reason that we're trying to get into discussing culture is because I think people want to kind of re-engineer success, and culture gets thrown out there. Every time there's a new hire or a team's been losing, they always bring in someone, and the first thing that you hear is like, we're revamping things, and One of my favorite tweets was actually by one of the writers from, um, one of the sports writers, Mike Tanier. I think I'm probably butchering his name, but he talked about cliche words that are going to happen, which is team culture, leadership, commitment to excellence, and you hear that all the time. So, maybe you guys could probably go into, where are you hearing these, I think an increase of discussion of team culture with colleges down to the high school level.
John, you want to start?
Well, like I would agree with that. I think it's certainly something that is it's tough to define. It's kind of like how people throw around the word high performance. Like what is that definition? But I think it's still a concept that is very important. Maybe a little overblown. And Carl, you and I have had brief discussions about it, right? But I think it still boils down to maybe a consistent messaging that comes from the top down when leading a sports team or franchise. But maybe in the media, it just gets, culture just sounds a lot sexier. Leadership sounds sexier. Like it just sells more than just trying to say like, hey, we just need to make sure that everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It is definitely a language vernacular issue of what is my best choice of words to describe this positive thing I'm going to do. Everybody can identify with it, I guess, whether it's, like you've said, functional training or sustainable energy, so it is a lazy word. I mean, if I can use that, it's like, what am I going to do? I just got hired. They want to pay me lots of money. This team sucks. Well, let's change the culture, right? I mean, we talked about this before, like, rather than let's have a press conference and let's go through our roster. Well, this guy is not fast enough. This guy can't catch. This guy is terrible at tackling. Like, nobody does that, right? But, it's easier to say, we're going to change this. Like, we could change, like, let's not use the word culture. Let's call it something else. Let's call it let's call it vanilla pudding. We're going to change the vanilla pudding. Right? I mean, that's how ridiculous it is, right? And everybody goes, oh, I know what the vanilla pudding is, right? Or the Easter bunny, as we talked about before.
Yeah, the Easter bunny or the boogeyman. It's just to say, hey, and I'm not going to get too much into politics, but usually that's the issue, is the mysterious person that's going to take Medicare away from the elderly in the U.S. every 4 years, when each side is claiming that they're going to take away Social Security or whatever. It's always the boogeyman. The team culture. Gremlin that's out there, that he's like the Noid from the early 80s, from Domino's, where suddenly they're going to attack things. So I think with the one of the core issues is what the definition of it is. And I went to I put in team culture on Google Images just to throw out those cliche flow charts and hierarchies and all the stuff that you see at global leadership conferences and all this stuff, and it's very vague. It's lazy, and I think that what we need to do is start saying, okay, can you slice down team culture into something such as, what's your philosophy of, quote, organization? So one of the things that I was really impressed with when I was in high school, and I mentioned this recently, is that the coach that I had was the National Coach of the Year. Now, keep in mind, there's about 25,000 high schools. And when he won, we're kind of spoiled because, we won a state title every couple of years. And my colleague, who later became my my assistant coach, said there's a difference between coaching a team and running a program. And when I heard that, I finally understood the differences between a good coach and a great coach is that extra steps that they do in order to have a higher success rate. And winning does matter. I've never seen a great team culture that loses all the time. I mean, take a look at the Los Angeles Clippers, a team that has, never won an NBA championship. Does anyone say that they have the best team culture, but simply just can't find a way to win? So recently, obviously, they're doing pretty well, but you can see where I'm going. I think team culture without winning just doesn't exist. You can do that for a year when people think, hey, the ship is redirecting, but you can't have sustained losing and great team culture. It's just mutually exclusive. So maybe we can talk about winning and how that equation is it retroactive? Does a team that wins has automatically good team culture, or is there been any type of dynasties with really bad team culture, but the talent of the coaches and the investment of the owners or the recruiting, there's got to be something there. So maybe you guys can go into how important winning is.
Well, it's always going to be, I think everybody's going to gravitate to whatever the winning teams are doing, the same way that like the sport performance coaches or maybe athletes are drawn to what the best athletes in a given sport do for training, without really having any other reference points. But I do still think that there are teams out there that maybe do well or fluctuate around their own mean and are successful relative to their means or their spending, right? So a team like the Oakland A's pops into my head, or I should say the Oakland A's of the early 2000s, where they had relative success to how much they were spending in their payroll, and maybe their culture was trying to find those guys that were slipping through the cracks through the Moneyball era. Now, I don't think anybody came out and said, Oakland A's, top-notch culture, this is what we need to emulate. But certainly other teams came and started picking at some things that they were doing well and translated it into their own particular situation.
Sure. And what do you think about colleges, Derek?
Well, I mean, it's the college sports realm is so contingent on, obviously the talent you recruit. You could rationalize that there's some further development of physical abilities and, another one of these lazy words, the development of character. But, I mean, from what I've seen and from what I gather, once you bring somebody in their first year, there's so much potential for growth. And a lot of that growth is going to happen by being placed in competitive situations and developing skills under those circumstances. Obviously, you don't want to have a situation where players are breaking the law or, just creating a poor image for the organization. But at the same time, are these coaches creating this culture to lead them to winning when they really have all this talent in place? Maybe the coaches are organized, that's obviously important. They mix it all together and, there is a bit of natural selection and randomness to it. But I think after the fact, people like to say that they've, once they've won, they like to say that they've created this culture when, a lot of this stuff could just be, I'm not going to say coincidental or luck, but it's going to be based on circumstances, maybe even beyond their control, aside from bringing all these people together,
Yeah, obviously we rehash kind of the winning side. It's like when you win, all sins are forgotten. I think that's where sustainable winning, meaning dynasties, is there a pattern? And are you one and done? I mean, look at a good example of this is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. When they won, that was an apex of probably the years before that when, Tony Dungy was there and they were just always on that edge. And I think obviously getting, Chucky for that, that key time, which was getting them over the hump on the offensive side, they won, but they couldn't sustain that. And so, when I look at sustainability, anytime, a broken clock is going to tell the time correctly twice a day. And so that's what we need to do is to say, is this a consistent pattern, or is this because somehow the stars aligned and there's just a lot of talent, including on the coaching side? Sometimes you have some diamonds in the rough offensive and defensive coordinators or you have a staff that really did an amazing job of recruiting. So those are some things to consider. But I think when we look at team culture, it always gets into team chemistry. And then when you go to team chemistry, it goes into locker room leadership. And for me, I've always been kind of curious about the locker room because apparently all this magic is happening there, you know. And, the question is who, it's easy to kind of go to a combine and see someone's vert and 40-yard dash, but no one has a locker room leadership. They do the Wonderlic and they do the interview, but, how do we evaluate leadership from the team side? It just seems to be, it's a very gray area. So how would you look at it from, I'd say, let's get away from just talking about football, but let's look at baseball. I mean, we talked about the MLB and the Oakland A's. How will we look at that in the clubhouse?
I would imagine that would have to be it's very situational, I would imagine. I think locker room leadership is completely different in a team full of veterans versus a team full of rookies. Yeah. It's something that has to be like the same way that you alluded to the dynasties. It's something that would have to be sustained, right? Is somebody a capable leader maybe just because they were placed in the right environment where they were able to stand out as leaders, but maybe in a different environment they can't stand out as leaders as much. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have like a full, well thought out answer for that, to be honest.
No, but that's actually a good sign that anytime, I'm not here to stump people, is like this. These are legitimate questions and they're not rhetorical by any means. Is because like I'm just like to play dumb and start saying, okay, anytime there's a lot of momentum towards a concept, and it always sounds like that dangerously vague and quote lazy, it's just easy just to plug it in. I get worried because it's like anytime you do a team visit or you go and do an audit or some sort of review of a program, I always look at the basics. Like I was down with one NBA team and we drove into the facility and it was depressing. I mean, the whole area was underground. It was dark, and and it was hard to navigate. It was rusty. It's like, how can you go to how are you? The first thing you do to walk in, it just looks like a Terminator apocalypse type area, and then it's like you're literally underground. You're not seeing daylight.
So what you're saying is they had a poor subculture?
Gosh, you're too quick for me on that one. But then again, I was talking to the one of the directors of performance. She was very clear, saying, "Hey, this is a problem. This is something that you're going to confront." And I'm not saying that a strength coach needs to be out there with a costume on and cheering people on every time and giving high fives every time people walk in, because that's a gimmick. But there's some things to consider. Like a new facility. I went to a couple of years ago, the St. Louis Blues, and their training facility, right? And what was frightening is it's adjacent to like a shopping mall, like literally next to like a Panera Bread or a Panera restaurant. And it's like you get there and it's like, wah, wah, wah. It doesn't have that, you're not driving up to, whatever the address is and it has this megaplex. So, it's hard. These are the things that are real. Yet no one's talking about it. No one said, okay, let's review the top training facilities and rank them. That's because that's half the time the players are going to be there at least. Mainly with MLS and in NFL where they only compete once a week. Cool. So I think those are some important variables.
Well, it was interesting. I finally had a chance to watch the 30 for 30 on USC football, the Trojan Horse one.
Yeah.
And I found that interesting because, they're trying to look at, what were the circumstances under which Pete Carroll came in and created this environment of winning and success. And I didn't know it was so bad before he got there. So I thought, possibly it was okay and he just made it better, but it was quite bad. And I know that I visited Chris Carlisle
when he was a strength coach there in 2003, 2004, 2005. I just want to see what's going on, right? And one thing that I remember was, wow, they have a really bad, ugly weight room. It's in the basement. You had to walk down these stairwells that weren't very pleasant, and oh, look, O.J. Simpson on the wall, right? And you get down there, and it looked like a room, and then they knocked down a wall and had another room. So it wasn't a very attractive facility, and his office was like a broom closet, but yet they were having all this success. And even when you went up stairs and then you had to walk across the street to go to their practice field, it was a wood fenced in practice field, and there was nothing special about it, but there was kind of this feeling or vibe that this was special, obviously because they were winning, in a very, very positive environment. But from a facility point of view, it wasn't anything impressive at all. If anything, I was kind of taken back.
Well, I think there's a point where, is culture something that's tangible, or it's a vibe? Okay, back then, that's, when you have talent, when USC had, Reggie Bush, a guy like that could be at a dungeon weight room and just simply, you don't need that. I mean, in fact, maybe that's what a lot of the successful programs are looking at, is moving away from the chrome and the posh facilities to something a little bit more earthy. And I'm not saying you need to have a dump to succeed, or conversely, you don't need to have some sort of utopian mega complex. But there's something to be said, is like, if Pete was bringing that stuff down, it's going to be contagious regardless of where they are. Especially if someone's won before, or they've come from the NFL. It's look at Nick Saban. He obviously won before he got to Alabama. So anyway, I mean, you can get into countless discussions on that.
I'm just impressed you're on a first name basis with Nick Saban.
Oh no,
oh,
no, I didn't want to make it too formal. Trying to make it casual, trying to improve the culture.
Now, I was going to ask John this, like, is this just something for team sports? Is this just a phenomenon where we're creating this fabulous culture? And obviously there's some stuff going on with British cycling right now, but is working with individual sport athletes, is there the same dynamic involved?
Well, I have to answer that and just let you know that even though I did work with individual sport athletes, they still were very much part of a team. And that culture vibe, so to speak, is still very important. It's still something that, again, especially now that we've had this conversation, maybe culture vibe is the wrong word, but making sure that there are some consistent messages from the coaching staff to the athletes, from the high performance director to the athletes, around expectations, around just the way that you carry yourself through training, taking care of yourself outside of training, and those sort of things. So to me, that's where it's most important, right? Where if there's no consistent messaging, I think maybe that's where I would say culture lies, is that you all have to have a common goal and some set expectations around what you're trying to achieve. And then I think everything else just kind of falls into place. Like if you have a head coach that is supportive of what the strength coach does, it doesn't really matter if you have a dungeon weight room with rusty bars and dilapidated medicine balls versus a hospital gym. It does. I don't think it really matters as long as the message is consistent.
Yeah, I mean that's the same thing. And I think that just kind of diagnosing what you just described there is, expectations, guidelines, communication, respect. All these words are, to me, are more descriptive than saying culture. And I would implore people to kind of get into more detail when describing what the circumstances or environment is like to create a positive, result. What do you think, Carl?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of mixed feelings with, what we're trying to argue is what's the formula, and can we identify that, like a common goal? Like, all right, how many countries, let's just take a winter sport like bobsled. How many countries legitimately are saying they're going to try to win? You're not going to. I'm just sorry if unless you're north of the equator, it's just not happening. See, it's not that I don't think that Brazil can ever win a championship. It's just there's just constraints that we have to kind of face. There is also something about pride. When we say, okay, you can have a facility that's like a dungeon, is it a clean dungeon? So I think when we look at, things that are hard to quantify, but we all know that they're important, how do we evaluate pride? You have some programs that are very strict and everyone's tucking in their shirt, but then you see the effort on the lifts and it's very average. Then you have like some teams, they come in and it's almost like a bunch of rebels. There's no everyone's individual and everyone's training hard, but you don't see, sort of that regiment. You don't see that really strict control over them. I think that's why when you look at team culture, it gets back into the military side. Everyone talks about being organized, but does everyone need to be almost militant in that overly structured area? Or do you allow for some creative individualization? I think that if you see a warm up, does it look like, North Korea, marching in the streets? Or does it look like everyone's an individual athlete doing what they need to do? So there's, I don't want to get into nationalism discussions, but when you see pride, and sometimes you always see this, you see the mascot and say, well, this is how we do it here. Well, unless you win it every year by dominating everyone, or what if you've never won? What if you take a team that's never won and you bring in someone that's never won themselves, like a coach that's, he was never an assistant that even saw a championship. If you haven't touched the Lombardi Trophy, does that mean like you can't win? I'm not saying that, but I'm also saying you have to win somewhere and keep raising the stakes. So I think the question is, where would you learn for resources on team culture? I mean, everyone's, you have all these experts out there. What's the great way to get started?
Well, it's really good now that we're into the off season for the NFL. We have, quite a few teams who've brought in new staff. Obviously have to turn things around. I don't want to specifically dwell on any particular team, but there's a team that didn't win much last year, and they're obviously trying to figure out what to change. If you look at a team like the Oakland Raiders, I don't know, are they still the Oakland Raiders?
They're going to be Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, okay. Yeah. So, obviously they've turned things around, but a lot of that is highly dependent on the roster and who they have, and we saw what happened when they lost one of their top players. So, it is this really highly iterative process, but it is highly dependent on the actual players that you have. And if, you have positive results with those players, then obviously this culture factor improves and people probably communicate better and probably people are more positive with each other. And so it's a very synergy related issue that's dependent on obviously some base elements. But like you said, you can have great culture and people can take that blueprint of what speech we do before the game and how many reps we do here and how much we vomit. But, the last place team could be doing that too. And that's often what you see, what are they doing? They're in first place. Let's do that here. Yeah, but your players still suck and, you can't get a first down. So,
the copycat league, and there's, that's what happens all the time. I mean, I'm not saying that, if Chuck Daly was the coach for the Bulls, would they have won? Obviously it's not the best coach. Sometimes it's just the right coach. And I look at, was Jordan a function of the triangle offense? He's a system basketball player? Of course not. So I just think that, a lot of this stuff is happenstance. And, no one wants to just admit. Sometimes it's just really good to have, I don't know, some great talent, not getting injured. I mean, look at Derek Carr. He fractured his leg. So the game after that, it doesn't really matter what the culture is when you don't have the best quarterback on the field.
Yeah, or if Michael Jordan retires for a couple of years, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. They got the culture back 2 years later, right?
Well, I mean that's obviously the Bulls were when Tony Kukoc and Scotty were there were close. They still it was a possibility that they could have made the finals without Jordan. Would I think they would have won? Probably not. I mean, that was when you got Elijah won. But my point is that Scottie Pippen's a Hall of Fame athlete. You still have Phil Jackson. You still have the other players that were pretty darn good. So I think that removing the talent and removing the resources, the question is again, where would you go? And I think that I like the idea of someone winning and successful at multiple locations, because that's a common denominator to say, okay, they're bringing something to the table that's repeatable. And I always am very fascinated when a coach leaves. Obviously there's recruiting processes, there's a talent acquisition side, no matter what the sport is. When you see a head or an assistant track coach become a head track coach at another location, you see a national coach go from one country and then they go to another Olympic campaign somewhere else, or some sort of like World Cup or in rugby or soccer. You're going to see someone kind of shift and say, okay, what's going to happen over the next couple of years? You're usually going to see the most immediate thing is people are going to buy in because they weren't happy. That's why the guy's there. You don't really fire, no one's going to, Bob Kraft's not going to fire Belichick and say, you know what, I'm just not feeling his culture. We won and everything, but I think we need a different change. I want a different type of mood. You're not going to see that. You usually want to change culture because you're losing. So then after that, then you bring in this person, and it's usually the person that's going to save things. You've seen that, with 1980, Miracle on Ice. It's always going to be like Mighty Duck experience, the Hollywood thing where you bring in a new coach and then magic happens. They start winning and it's historical, it's streaks, and that's great. But that's usually in the movies, unless you have someone like a Bill Sweetenham, who's he's obviously shown some impact in swimming, going from Australia to the UK. I mean, that's a great example.
Well, how about the LA Lakers when they won with when Magic was in his first year, and the coach that had the run and gun offense was the head coach, and then they got rid of him. Even though they won the championship, he was at Loyola Marymount. The coach I'm talking about? I can't remember his name offhand. But anyways, so they won, and then they fired him. And then they brought in Pat Riley, and they continued to do well. But I found that was pretty interesting. And the players, a couple of the players, I think one of them was Magic, didn't like the system, even though they had won the championship. But
with basketball, it's definitely a players' league, because the impact of one player playing both offense and defense and only being 5 on the team is dramatically different than, for example, the best example is football. Unless it's a quarterback and they said, I just don't like this offensive system. You look at Peyton Manning when he had his guy. Obviously he gelled with his offensive coordinator / quarterbacks coach. So I think, yes, that's a rare occasion, and that's why it's rare, Derek, that you just don't see too much change unless everyone knows that, like here's an example. We just had a recent firing here in Boston for Claude Julien, and he was there for a very long time, and during the hate to bring this up, but during the finals in Vancouver, they kind of had like a closed door meeting about some strategy changes. And that was not coming from a lateral side, it's coming top down. And, there's a lot of situations where the coach is brought in because, they have maybe a presence or a way to keep guys. He's a player's coach, but then you have to bring in the retired, guru that's coming back to do a little consulting, like Bill Walsh, for example, obviously has done it 3 championships with the 49ers and then became a consultant, at the very end of his career after being a GM VP. So anyway, I could get into tangents, but I think that what I would like to see now is, if we're going to go and discuss team culture and all this other stuff, is just have some sort of real tangible, something that you can really grasp and say, you know what, anyone with a pair of eyes could say, you know what, that's logical, it's reasonable, it's something that I could probably apply, and it's not cliche, it's not tongue-in-cheek, it's not, like the commitment to excellence and all those posters you see at the malls in the mid-90s where it's like a bald eagle flying in the in the sky, and then you're saying, some sort of cheesy quote. Something really realistic. Freedom. It's always freedom, or like something like that. It's like it's a perfection. That type of stuff. Yeah.
Now, I was talking to John about this, and if we use that New England Patriots example, do you, even though they have the same coach and same quarterback, they've had all these other changes in personnel, do you still give them a free pass in terms of, they've done it under different circumstances? Would that be equivalent to moving to another organization, or is it purely an organizational thing that's happening there?
Well, I've been doing this for a long time. What I've been doing is looking at coaches' trees. So when you look at the coaches and the coaching tree, which is, where did they come from and who underneath them, what type of fruit did they bear? So it's fascinating because you can always look at some of these coaching trees, and some of it you can see that were they given a chance because they were successful somewhere else and the branch died, meaning once they got their opportunity, no one underneath them continued. So it's like the game of telephone. They were kind of close to the success and they have a couple things. So like retelling a joke and you'll get some laughs, but you won't be as good as a comedian. I think there's a point where you can learn a lot from the patterns of where do these coaches come from. Look at Bill Belichick and Parcells. There's a definite connection there. And look at the strength coaches that came there. Mike Wojcik, a strength coach that has 6 rings. He's got 3 with the Patriots, and he had 3 with the Cowboys. Now, in between, no one remembers the Saints. That was the years where they didn't have Drew Brees. So when someone goes, "Hey, this guy has all these rings," I always say, "Okay, yeah, but like if they were to go somewhere else, like a team that's really difficult to see success, and I don't think they have a bright future, is Cleveland. Unless they have a good quarterback, there's no chance in this, especially in this day and age of a passing league." So, I know that we're getting into tangents here, but I think the safe question is to say, okay, how can we really get something that, coaches education, and not on the sports science, but maybe on the administrative side. I think that's the future, is the administration being organized. The leadership has to be, we're not going to go to some, I don't know if it's Tony Robbins or something like that, but it has to be something where it's mature and it's realistic. And if we can provide that for coaches, I think people are really happy. I think there's a thirst for it, but because anyone can masquerade themselves as a leadership guy, there's no I don't have a PhD in leadership. I mean, you just can't get that type of, that education easily accessible to people.
Well, John, what do you think about this notion that's being put out there by, the head coach comes out and says, the strength coach is the most important coach we have on staff at this football program? What do you think about that?
I wish more people thought that way. No, you know what? I think it's great to come out and be supportive of that. And maybe it's something that needs to come out and say for their particular scenario, to show the players that this is how the coach feels in the face of the media. So if the coach is putting that much stock in their strength coach, then maybe it's a different way of relaying the message to the players that, hey, whatever you do off the field is also very important. But Carl, I wanted to kind of touch on what you had mentioned, and you talked a little bit about bobsleigh in Brazil, right? And how that wouldn't be probably not going to yield results right away. And then just in your last comment, the word that really stuck out to me was realistic, and how you make impact from the administrative side. And I think it's really important to think that maybe some of these examples that we're looking to for leadership or culture or whatever it may be we'd gravitate to them not just because they are winning franchises, right? But maybe there's something to be learned about some other franchises that aren't as successful. So we talked about the Oakland A's, the Phoenix Suns of late 90s, early 2000s, where they ran the 4-guard offense, is also another way where you kind of mold to your own particular scenario. You change the culture, so to speak, in air quotes, and still have relative success. And making sure, are we going to lead the league in rebounds with a 4-guard offense? Probably not. So that's not realistic. But, can we maintain possession, wear out the clock in that regard? Maybe that's something that we can achieve, right? Brazil, can we podium in bobsleigh at the next Winter Olympics 2018? Absolutely not going to happen. But can we take 4 fast sprinters and maybe over the course of 6 years make them relatively competitive to the point there that they are middle of the pack in the World Cup? So then that's realistic. And what are the steps that you take in order
maybe
to
have
get
the best start time, even though the driving's not really their bag,
right?
Yeah.
And then eventually, like, let's say Brazil did want to put a lot more resources behind that. If you start to have some success, then maybe it's a lot easier to get corporate sponsorship. You can start taking more teams so that they can spend a whole winter training in Germany, where they have 6 tracks, as opposed to Brazil, where you'd have no ice.
Or maybe they could change the sport, so you had to do Brazilian jiu-jitsu at the top, and then the teams had to jump into their sleds, right? Like a Jerry Seinfeld.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like those are some valid points. I think a good closing discussion point is that I think that the fact that we're having the conversation and putting team culture underneath the microscope and being it in a way that none of us are trying to, I think it's valuable. I know there's something there. I believe in it. I apply what I've learned. So it's not a bashing against team culture. And that's not what we're doing. We believe that, hey, there's a couple team policies, and I want to get into rules, but some of these organizations have really good policies in place to say, hey, no jerks. If a guy is a cancer in the locker room, the first thing they want to do is say, hey, maybe phase him out with someone of comparable talent, because we don't want the rookies to start to get lazy and start developing bad habits or something. So I believe in team culture. I think what's fair is to say, well, how do we evaluate it? When you say art and science, it's easy to look at the sciences and measure that. Art, to evaluate, it's kind of the eye in the beholder. So, with any type of, a more abstract type of quality, it requires a criteria process to kind of tease this stuff out so that one can actually have a solid and really observable change in team culture. Do people show up on time? What's the attendance in the weight room? So I think those little things, success has clues, and so does team culture in a way. How much does it actually cascade down? I just saw a quote where, team culture is not when the coach demands something, is when the players already know what the coach demands, and they're able to verbalize that to people that aren't familiar, like either freshmen or rookies or people that are just acquired. So I think if we can go and start focusing on getting something that's not just realistic, but something that's clear and not warm and fuzzy, I think that we can start dissecting team culture into really small, narrow things that you can say, okay, it's clear that there's been a change or an enhancement, or there's been a negative change, meaning we've regressed a lot here, and then what we've worked on didn't continue because we focused on something else, and we need to go back. So I think that's it for me. I'm, just get the clock says dinner for me, so I gotta head out. But
well, I agree. I mean, just to summarize, I agree that I don't mind if people use the term culture. Just please define it for us and show us what comprises your good culture. And even if it's like C, communication, U, unity, L, leadership, whatever, But and I'm sure John feels the same about it. This idea of expectations, goals, policies, roles,
Sure.
code of conduct.
Yeah, no, and making sure, like Carl, like you said, realistic, and also situation dependent, right? That, like you alluded to, no dickheads, and that's something that everybody takes from that the book about the All Blacks. But if you take that to maybe another sports franchise, like if you say no dickheads, you might lose your best players. That could be the case, right? Or, Bill Belichick likes to say, somebody had mentioned this, I don't know if it's true, but somebody said that part of his culture is do your job, right? You take that into a different scenario, and that might seem really restrictive, right? So it has to be situation specific and realistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why it says, maybe that's the under Belichick that would work, but then what if you're not Belichick? Let's say, offensive coordinator takes over the team. Will he have that? He'll have a lot of overlapping principles because that obviously stuff is working, but then that might not be, you can't replicate that. Maybe that you have to define your own path of it. So this has been a great discussion. I think I've gotten more out of this than, just debating whether, general or specific training transfers to sprinting. But, I think the next time that we do talk is, I think we got to move away from the team culture side and start looking at accountability and losing, and what we can do. All right.
Sure.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.
All right. Thanks, guys. And we'll talk later.
Take care.
Bye.
So I hope you got something out of that conversation on sporting culture. I think the main impetus was to just get people to think about the word before they started using it, very generally. I'm not going to say irresponsibly, but just think about the details behind what that cultural model should look like, how you're going to measure the success of that model, and how you're going to sustain it, really. What's the plan? What are the details? And I think when people start thinking along those lines, maybe they won't rely so much on just the word itself to create this illusion that something good is going to happen. Really put a plan together and take people through all the steps. So I'm really looking forward to hearing people's feedback on this idea of sporting culture and how we can actually make it work. So as usual, if you can provide feedback on Facebook at Strength Power Speed, or on Twitter at Strength Power Speed, and in both cases Strength Power Speed has no vowels, and we'll also post on YouTube. So there's a number of ways you can chime in and let us know your thoughts, and we're looking to hear more about what you think about sporting culture. Thank you very much.